Hello, Lexington. This is Samantha Jean Moore, and I am downtown at our historic courthouse. And today I'm going to be interviewing Chuck Eddy. He's a moderate Republican, and he's running against Andy Barr. And I think it's pretty important to listen to his perspective. So I follow him on Facebook, and I know that he is fiscally conservative. He's not a big fan of Trump, and he has a reasonable stance on abortion. Tell us a little bit about yourself. Tell us where you're from, and just who you are as a candidate.
Sure. So my name is Chuck Eddy. That's E-D-D-Y, not like Eddy's ice cream, E-D-D-Y. I grew up outside Philadelphia until I was 18, went to college, met my wife the second day of college, got married, and we've been together about 50 years. She's the saint in the relationship, and I'm the other guy. So I was raised in a Republican family. But to give you an idea of why I call myself a lifelong moderate Republican, my mom was involved in civil rights. She worked in a civil rights community center. A community center was set up in a black community right near where I lived. Our schools were integrated, but the community was, I grew up in a white community just a block away from a black community. So I was very aware from a young age. I've been very aware of politics. I'll be honest, until about 2015, I read, I studied, I prayed, I voted, and I went to bed knowing that I wasn't going to be worried that the world was going to blow up the next morning with who was elected. So that brings us to 2015, okay? So ever since then, I've been very concerned with the direction of the country. I've been very concerned with the direction of my Republican Party. In my opinion, my Republican Party has been hijacked by a lot of people who are hard right, and they don't hold the values of Abraham Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt, Dwight Eisenhower. For those of you who are from Kentucky, you may recall we used to have two moderate senators, Thruston Morton and John Sherman Cooper. They were two of the Republicans, 29 Republicans, that voted to help pass the 1964 Civil Rights Bill and the 1965 Voting Rights Bill. I'll be honest, I'm not sure that our current senators would have voted for those, because when we've tried to put some teeth back into the voting rights bill, they've opposed it. So basically, that's where I'm from. Was in the business world for a long time, worked in the soft drink industry for about 34 years. I worked in call centers about 12 years. I worked for Aflac Insurance for a while. I'm just a basic guy. The only reason that I got involved is because I was unhappy with Andy Barr's stances on things. So that basically gives you the background of where I'm at.
What are the issues that you are most passionate about? Like, if you could put your platform in a nutshell, what would you say are your key issues that you're interested in?
So there's basically three key issues: healthcare, Social Security, tax reform, okay? On healthcare, I believe healthcare is a right. I believe that your zip code, I used to live in Irvine, 40336, or your income should not dictate whether or not you have healthcare. It should not. I want to have a public-private partnership to extend health care to everybody. I'm not personally in favor for Medicare for all. I'm not interested in blowing up the system. I'm interested in improving the system. I think it's very vitally important. We've seen with COVID-19 how important it is that we have good health care. The reason I first got going opposing Andy Barr is he was going to vote for the bill that was going to gut Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare. Now, in the process, there were three key things that he was voting to end. The number one thing he was voting was to take away health insurance from 24 million Americans. The number two thing he was going to do is he was going to take away protection for pre-existing conditions from all Americans, because that was new with the Affordable Care Act. If you were an insurance agent, Samantha, and I applied to you, you could say, you know, you got sleep apnea, I can't cover you. That's no longer legal. Okay?
Even things like pregnancy are considered a
pre-existing condition. Yes, they are. But here's the thing. It's interesting that you mentioned pregnancy, because the other thing that he was voting against, he would have gotten rid of the 10 basic health essentials. The 10 basic health essentials included things like access to mental health care, access to health care to deal with opioid addictions. Our state has been ravaged by opioid addiction. There's not a single person I know that doesn't have a family member or a friend who knows somebody who died of opioid addiction. That's just tragic, okay? One of the other things that had was access to prenatal health care, very, very important for successful pregnancy, and also access to birth control. Now here's why that's so important. I'm personally against abortion except for rape, incest, health of the mother, inability of the fetus to survive outside the womb. But I am not in favor of legislative solutions. I'm in favor of healthcare solutions. For those watching, if you're not aware, abortions have been coming down in the last 10 years, okay? Now, I went to public schools. I'm a big public school advocate. One thing I learned in public schools is that the best way to prevent many abortions is to prevent unplanned pregnancies.
Education.
Yes, education. But here's a really neat thing. The best way to prevent unplanned pregnancies is birth control. So the Affordable Care Act has in it that women get free birth control. Now, I would like to also see men have access to free birth control for men as well. I think that's important. So Andy was going to get rid of that. Now, the interesting thing is that would have produced more abortions.
Correct.
By getting rid of the free birth control and all that. So I was very much against that. So that's what prompted me to run against Andy the first time 2 years ago, and I'm back again. So healthcare was the number one thing. Number two, I want to protect Social Security. We need to find additional funding sources that don't add taxes to the individual person, okay? But Social Security is extremely important. That's what I want to be in there to protect. And the third thing is tax reform. And it's very important that we have a good tax system. For those of you who remember back to Dwight Eisenhower, there was a higher tax on progressive tax. As it went up, people, paid more.
The more money you make,
more money, okay? There was also a higher corporate tax and all those things. Now, what many people may or may not remember is the economy then and what the government did was stronger. That's when we built all these interstates, okay? But that tax detail is not as important as what Andy Barr, so in 2017, Trump, McConnell, and Barr said, we're going to pass this tax cut, and it is going to be great because it's going to do this. It's going to grow the economy. Oh, that's awesome. And it's going to not cost anything. It's going to pay for itself. And the companies who get the corporate tax cut, and by the way, that ended up being 85% of the total tax cut. The companies got a permanent tax cut. Individuals got a temporary tax cut. See anything wrong with that, folks? Okay.
Wasn't huge for the individual. It was great
no, it
for
wasn't.
big business.
And they took away some deductions for some people that hurt the individual. Let's focus on the corporate taxes because that's the biggest part of it. So the corporate tax cut, in reality, the majority of companies that receive that corporate tax cut use that money to buy back their own stock.
Right.
So basically, if you want to look at it, they lined their own pockets and they left us holding the bag, okay? So that's wrong. So I want to see that corporate tax repealed, rolled back. I know it's weird to have it here in a Republican saying that, but I'm fiscally conservative, and that tax cut was not fiscal conservatism. And I want to roll it back except for companies making under $100 million. The reason is these are the small and medium companies that build America, that add the jobs. It's not the big companies. Those people who bought the stock and then kept it, okay, to raise the value of their stock were wrong. In addition to that, the companies who use that money, that tax cut money, to buy back their own stock instead of investing in people, investing in benefits, investing in capital investment, they should be charged back and have to pay back to the U.S. Treasury the amount of money they spent on that stock. Give it back. That tax cut that was supposed to pay for itself is ending up costing us $1 trillion to $2 trillion. That added to our national debt. We could have sure used that. And in fact, right now, McConnell and some of the people are opposing money for the state and the cities. They can't afford it anymore. But here's the deal. That's a place I can get the funds. The funds are right there, except they gave it away to their buddies or their special interest corporate donors that Mr. Barr has a lot of.
Instead of reinvesting in our economy, they just let that money go to rich corporations who already have plenty.
Well, and here's the thing. If those companies had all gone out and done capital investment, I wouldn't have a problem. But there was
if
no
they had
strings
raised
attached.
salaries for workers instead of giving bonuses to CEOs.
Well, and here's the irony. Some of those companies who got a corporate tax cut paid a one-time bonus to some of their employees. depending on how long they were there, that bonus and those raises actually added up to only about 5% of the American workforce. About 3% of the American workforce. About 5 million people, workers, actually got a raise or a bonus through that. Now here's the really tragic thing. Some companies actually laid off workers after they got their corporate tax cut. AT&T is one of them. They laid off about 10,000 people right after. And that's just flat wrong.
Congressman Andy Barr is a fellow member of the Republican Party, but you two don't agree on everything. Can you comment on why you would be a better choice for Kentucky?
Andy Barr's votes are very much skewed, in my opinion, towards the interests of his special interest corporate donors. The big tax cut didn't benefit you or me or the people recording this, okay? The healthcare vote, to take away healthcare, one of his largest donors is the insurance industry. His largest donor is the American Banking Association. These are not people who are actually looking out for middle-class Kentuckians.
Might I add that Kentucky has one of the highest numbers of uninsured people in the state, and we have high levels of poverty. So
we do. What's interesting also, last year when Bevin was talking about taking Medicaid away from a lot of people, the irony is the largest percentage of people on Medicaid are in eastern Kentucky. And to have that taken away, and that's what Andy Barr voted to do too, take that away, that would be tragic. I know in the last election when I was knocking on doors, talking to people about this losing Medicaid, even in central Kentucky, everybody's got a family member in eastern Kentucky somewhere, okay? Martin County, Pike County, whatever. And they know what losing Medicaid means. They know what losing protection for pre-existing Kentucky
life or
means.
death.
That's exactly right. So that's why that's so important to me. I'm going to be able to represent middle class, working poor, and marginalized Kentuckians that right now Andy Barr is not representing. So that's a huge divide between the two of us. And in the past, Republicans from a while ago were concerned about that. They were concerned about the people. I'm thinking back to those two gentlemen I mentioned that helped pass the Civil Rights and the Voting Rights Bill. Well, many Republicans were involved in developing the first, the Environmental Protection Agency was started under Richard Nixon. That's the Environmental Protection Agency that Trump is trying to dismantle. And again, the irony is he talks about how it hurts corporations and all that, the controls, regulations. But let's go back to eastern Kentucky again. The coal washes that don't have as much regulation harm the people right there. So that's why I can represent Kentucky better than Andy Barr can.
You were recently excluded from the primary debates. Why is that, and how do you feel about money in politics?
Well, I feel like the Citizens United decision was a disaster. It totally removed you and me from having that much of an impact with all the dark money. I would like to see the Citizens United reversed. That's the thing that Mitch McConnell very openly said. Money is free speech. I think that's garbage, okay? The debate you're talking about, last night they had a non-debate. Renee Shaw, who I have respect for, but last night, not so much. She has a program, Kentucky Tonight, and various people running for office were invited to be on, but they had to satisfy 3 different requirements. Number 1, you had to be on the ballot. That's legitimate. Number 2, you had to have a web page or Facebook or some kind of thing where people could look at your views. I had that. Number three is you had to have raised at least $25,000 in campaign donations, okay? I didn't satisfy number 3. Their decision is, we're applying it equally, you can't be on.
I don't feel good about that.
I don't feel good about that either, because I don't think you can be doing that. You can't be doing that. So here's the deal. 2 years ago, I ran against Andy Barr. I had $600 to spend.
Wow.
Okay? I got over 16% of the vote.
That's amazing.
Okay? But KET did not consider me worthy of being on their show because I didn't have $25,000 raised. Now, I've raised, as of the deadline they had, March 31st, I'd had about $8,500 in receipts. I've got a total of about $11,000 or so now. But here's the deal. You're not a legitimate candidate because you have millions of dollars. You're a legitimate candidate if you're on the ballot and if people have the opportunity to vote for you. Now, here's an interesting thing about the Federal Elections Commission, where I have to report to, okay? To be considered a viable candidate in their eyes and have to report to them, I have to have over $5,000. So the Federal Elections Commission is kind enough to consider me enough of a candidate that I will get fined if I don't report to them. But KET made the decision, no, you're not. So I'm not really that violent person, but I violently disagree with their decision. And then on top of that, I watched it last night, and the speed of the softballs that were pitched to Andy Barr was about a mile an hour, and there was no tough questions. I was embarrassed for Renee Shaw. And you asked me how I felt about it. That might say how I felt about it.
But I appreciate your honest opinion, and I agree. I don't think that you should have to pay to play, or just because a candidate has a certain amount of money does not make them viable. And just because a candidate is a grassroots candidate that doesn't have millions of dollars doesn't mean that we shouldn't be listening to what they have to say.
One of the problems in our country is money has got such a stranglehold really on both of the parties, okay? And with very rare exceptions, the parties seem to be okay with that. The thing about that stranglehold, what's interesting is 2 years ago I had $600 is all I had. They had no requirements for somebody to come. They invited both me and Andy Barr. Andy Barr chose not to show up 2 years ago. I showed up, Renee Shaw interviewed me, it was a good interview, okay? This year he chose to show up. He knew he would be by himself. He knew he didn't have anybody confronting him. Right. That's a load of garbage in my opinion.
Let's talk more about health care, since that seems to be a very important issue for you, and a very important issue to all Kentuckians.
Right.
So do you believe that COVID-19 is going to have long-term effects on our country?
It absolutely will. My wife and I have been following this since mid-January. I've got a family member of mine in the military in Italy. So we've been paying close attention because that's when things started blowing up. Now what's interesting, what a lot of people may not realize is the United States and South Korea had the first case reported on exactly the same day, okay? We now have over 110,000 deaths. As of yesterday, they had 273. 273 deaths. The reason is when it happened, they addressed it. Another thing I disagree with Andy Barr about a lot is on the show last night with Renee, she said, how do you feel Donald Trump did with the response? He said, I think he gets high marks. That's terrible. We have over 110,000 dead Americans because of the poor response that Trump did. And the caucus in Congress is also responsible. McConnell didn't call him out on it. Barr didn't call him out on it. In fact, in late March, Andy Barr was still sending out fundraising letters talking about the hoax that the Democrats who want to bring socialism were doing. So he was still using that. He never called him out to say, you need to be doing this. So while Donald Trump was saying, and the others were head in the sand, when Donald Trump was denying it's real, then lying about it, and then delaying dealing with it, Andy Barr has his head in the sand.
It's hard to believe that Democrats could create an illness like this that was fake, then the rest of the world is actually participating in it. Well, sometimes we don't pay attention to just what's happening, in the United States. It's happening around the world.
And that's a thing that saddens me, because we've been watching this since mid-January, my wife and I. We've basically been self-isolating since March 12th, something like that. We went to Frankfurt to get those new 8-year driver's licenses. That's the last time that she and I went out to something like that. Since then, I've only been inside a building a couple of times, post office and a tire store. I wear my mask all the time. You're a nice distance away, so I'm willing to take it off to protect you, not protect me, because the mask isn't meant to protect me. It protects others from me. My wife may wish that I'd had a mask on years ago, but anyway. The social distancing is very, very important.
That's the model that we've seen that's working in other countries,
That's
wearing
the model
masks
we've seen.
and social distancing.
Two examples. South Korea, like I said, has 273 deaths. 273. They have less deaths than the state of Kentucky, okay? The entire United States has 110,000 deaths that on the tombstone at the bottom should be an asterisk said, if only Donald Trump had done something earlier. If only he had spoken the truth. And Andy Barr and McConnell can be on there as well with a second asterisk, and we never said anything. That's a big deal. Now, I didn't really answer your question because you said long-term effects. Here's the deal. We're not done with these first waves, okay? The cases are upticking. They're upticking in other parts of the world. I'm very concerned about Africa and South America, very, very concerned. But here in this country, we have a number of states that are rising again. Even ours is. Fortunately, the very, very sick, the people in intensive care is still going down. Thank God. That's awesome. But you have to be prepared. This is why having health care in everybody's hands is so important. And like I said, I want a private-public partnership. That's what I want. But to think that we entered this pandemic with tens of millions of Americans with no health care. Now, what that means is you had people who didn't go to get checked. People without health care spread COVID-19 because they were afraid to go anywhere. That's tragic. That's on us, guys. That's on us.
Do you think that contact tracing is important? During this pandemic, what's more important, the health of everyone or personal privacy?
Well, here's the thing. One thing I want to remind everyone that COVID-19 has not read any of the constitutions, okay? COVID-19 ignores what your political belief is, what you think is right for you. I think it's very important that the individual accept the responsibility to protect the group. I was very upset when that pastor and some other people went to the state capitol to complain about things not being opened up. And then he said, take off your masks. You're not going to get it. Now, just recently, Baptist Church on Clays Mill Road has 18 cases that came out of an in-person congregation about 2 weeks ago. These are 18 cases that came from people not being careful about it.
And we've seen quite a lot of spread happening at churches.
We've seen that. That's right. So going back to your question, I believe personal responsibility is what we have to do. I believe that somebody said it best, your freedom stops when you can make me sick.
Healthcare costs are a big problem and people are going bankrupt. How do you make healthcare affordable for Kentuckians?
Well, I'll tell you what, that's the $64,000 question. There's a couple of major things that need to happen along with that. Number one, our surgery costs are the highest in the world by 2, 3, 4, 5 times. That's why a public-private partnership is so important, and controlling the costs of many of these surgeries, controlling the ancillary costs. The anesthetologist report, I said that, I don't know if I said it right. Anesthetologist charges, all of these secondary charges that still come back to the people. We have to have a way to handle them. What's interesting to me is Germany is a country that has universal health care, but they have private options there as well. They have been more successful in fighting COVID-19 by far than we have because they were smart about it, okay? So the question was about the cost. So we have to get those costs down. The prescription costs have to be under control. It's flat ridiculous that prescriptions cost 5, 10, 15, 20 times here what they do in other countries. Now, to that end, the solution is not, we'll just import them from Canada. That's stupid. We're making it, sending it there, and then bringing it back. That's flat stupid, okay? If you go back 6 years, the OECD is a group of the 25 developed countries in the world. In 2014, they did a study. 24 of the countries had universal health care. Different sizes, different ways, but everybody had insurance. One didn't, okay? The average cost of health care per capita that year was $3,000 for all of the OECD countries. The average cost for us that year was $9,000, 3 times as much. And what's more tragic, that was per capita. So I've got insurance, you've got insurance, you've got insurance, she doesn't have insurance. I still spent $9,000 against her.
So it's more expensive when we have people who are uninsured.
Very much more expensive. And what happens when you have people uninsured is you don't have the preventative medicine. You asked how to get the cost down.
Absolutely.
Preventative is so important. The 10 basic health essentials, access to prenatal health care, so important, so important.
Right now, hospitals are leaving Eastern Kentucky. Why is that, and what will it mean for those people?
It's going to be horrible. It's horrible. Again, this comes back to the way that we have constructed healthcare in this country means that we're not funding them well enough from the government. Okay, the reimbursements for their services are more controlled, and they have smaller. They can't extend their costs. You know, ARH, Appalachian Regional Health System, okay, has several hospitals, okay? If we lose a hospital in Pike County, or if we lose a hospital in Estill County, which when I lived there, we had Markham Wallace. I lived in Estill County for about 14 years. Had a little horse farm up on Barnes Mountain, loved it. If they lost that hospital, they would lose the place I went to when I had some kidney problems and then came into Lexington. But that first stop was there, and I had another situation where my first stop was there, taken care of in home, instead of driving 50 miles, okay? We've got to strengthen those, we've got to strengthen the doctor systems. One of the things I'd like to see in the educational system is we need to have a 10-year forgiveness program. It has been true in the past that if you go and work in these separate areas, you're going to get the cost of your education is going to come, you're not going to have to pay it.
Say if you're a healthcare worker
exactly.
or a teacher
That's
or
right,
something.
in a certain area. Now what's interesting is we've had that, but one of the problems right now with the current Department of Education, run by a lady who was never involved with public education at all, in fact, she's taken some of our stimulus money meant to go to public schools and funneled it to private schools. I'm not saying that she has an individual profit in it. I'm saying she's misdirecting the money, okay? I'm not a fan. They have like 10 or 11 yachts. I've lost track of how many they have. But the problem is that the loan forgiveness program, as it's going on in the federal government right now, has been very tightly constricted. In fact, one of the things that I'm also unhappy about with Andy Barr is he recently voted against a bill that would have helped a lot of veterans. We have a lot of veterans who are involved in these private universities and were persuaded to get high dollar loans. Sure. Okay, there was a bill to help get that better handled for forgiveness. It wasn't really a bill per se. The continuing resolution, they had to vote on part of it. Okay, so it was not a freestanding bill, but he voted the way that it's either 9 or 11 veterans agencies, I forget which, said that's terrible. You shouldn't have voted that way. You voted against veterans. And to me, you know, put your money where your mouth is. He's talked about supporting veterans, and his office does a good job of taking care of case management with veterans. His office does. But as a congressman, he just voted against the veterans. Sorry, that's not pro-veteran.
Because of the COVID-19 outbreak, many states, including Kentucky, could go bankrupt. Should states be allowed to go bankrupt, or should the federal government help?
No, the idea that Mitch McConnell said, well, maybe they should just go bankrupt, was totally foolish, okay? And any thinking legal mind will say they can't do that, okay? And for him to propose, and as Governor Beshear has said, in 2009, coming out of that recession, the government gave money to the state and local governments to help out because of that. There's no reason it shouldn't be done again. The money the state and local governments have already received doesn't help with their total revenue loss at all, because that money is strictly tied to what are you doing about COVID-19. So the lack of revenue, lack of receipts into the state government and the city government are not helped by that at all. The federal government absolutely must help them. And as I said earlier, Mitch McConnell has an easy place to get that money from. We repeal that corporate tax cut.
Do you believe that women should have access to abortion if they are raped, or if
Yes.
the pregnancy is life-threatening to the mother?
Yes. When I say I'm personally against abortion, except for the four major things: rape, incest, the health of the mother, or the inability of the fetus to survive outside the womb. Now, I know of women who have chosen to take an incest baby and carry it to term. I have great respect for them. But if that's the result, if pregnancy is a result of incest, I believe that's an acceptable reason to have an abortion.
I agree. Say if the mother was, say, 13 or something like that, we've definitely had cases like that in Kentucky.
It's very sad.
And I don't think that we can be the ones to make decisions about that.
Well, I think that, you know, when you look at those situations, rape, incest, health of the mother, inability of the fetus to survive outside the womb, these are decisions that a mother who, under other circumstances, may desperately want a child, has a situation they can't. I have a friend of mine. She has a condition that doesn't affect her, but it's hereditary. If she passes it on to a boy, that can kill the boy, okay? Wouldn't happen with a girl pregnant, it happens to the boy. She became pregnant, and up until 20 weeks, everything was wonderful. Everything's going on. 21st week, he died, you know, and it was so sad. And it broke her and her husband's heart, broke the hearts of all of us friends with her around the country, and it's just heartbreaking. You know, people making those decisions. That's why I get angry about people who say, you know, well, so-and-so had a late-term abortion. No, somebody had a late-term tragic medical procedure, and they probably already decorated their nursery.
Right. Most of the time, a late-term abortion is for people who really, really want their child.
It's an emergency medical procedure.
Out of their control.
That's right.
They've lost their child.
Like this woman I talked about. I know they had started decorating.
Right, and picked out baby names and all of that.
Oh yeah. Well, one of the things that they and we have all, we have honored her with talking about his name amongst our friends. You know, we know who she lost. We know his name.
We've all seen the recent protests in response to the killings of African Americans by police. Do you believe that there is systemic racism in law enforcement?
Yes. Now, having said that, saying there's systemic racism in law enforcement does not mean that everybody in law enforcement is a racist. Here's what's very important to me. You may even have a few organizations that have managed to deal with it and not have it within their organization, but I'm afraid it's too, and you know, our society has systemic racism. When you talk about the society as a whole, though, we don't all, well, we're not all walking around carrying guns. I guess there are some people who are, but we don't have the authority that people in the police, in policing do, okay? So that's got to be dealt with, and it's got to be dealt with strongly. We've got to do better vetting of people coming in, you know. We've got to do better periodic mental health exams of police officers. The demonstrations here in Lexington have been peaceful, but let me add to that, the demonstrations everywhere have been peaceful. There are violent people at the demonstrations. There are some looters who have come to demonstrations, but they are not part of the demonstrations. So to conflate that is ridiculous. Now, what I'm very proud of here, a couple of friends of mine, April Taylor and Sarah Williams, are leading the demonstrations here. They've been out every night at 8 o'clock. They are very strong on keeping an eye on people. They're always wearing their mask and encouraging other people to do it. And the demonstrations, while passionate, have been peaceful. And that's true pretty much everywhere, okay? These are demonstrations for a reason. It was tragic what happened to George Floyd. It was tragic what happened to, on my car, Breonna Taylor. Justice for Breonna Taylor. I was part of a car caravan last Friday. I haven't been to demonstrations because there's no social distancing, and I can't handle that. But let me say this, and another quarrel I have with Mr. Barr, and it's a major quarrel, is he waited until last Thursday, June 4th, to put on his Facebook page a condemnation of the killing of George Floyd. He waited until June 5th, the next day, Breonna Taylor's birthday, to make a condemnation on the killing of Breonna Taylor 3 months before, and again repeat the condemnation of George Floyd. Too little, too late, okay? And if you think about it, that condemnation of Breonna Taylor's, I think it was 85 days after she actually got killed, okay? That's what I'm dealing with. That's our current representative. I don't see the compassion there. I don't see the awareness. He doesn't have an awareness of the problems of, this is close to home, of middle class, working Kentuckians, working poor, and marginalized Kentuckians. That is vitally important. Mitt Romney went and marched, okay? Andy Barr hasn't. And I allow how he probably won't.
I want to go back to what you said about police officers.
Yes, sir.
Yes, ma'am. Because they have the authority, because they're carrying guns, their actions should be held to a higher standard, or what they do is more impactful. So do you believe that police should be held accountable when they use excessive force?
Well, absolutely. And one of the things, again, we have here in these demonstrations in many places, is they have a list of things that they want to make sure that the police are now accountable for, okay? The idea that somebody knelt on George Floyd and killed him, murdered him, and there were 3 others that were accessories to the crime. 2 of them were kneeling on him also. 1 was standing beside. That's ridiculous. 8 minutes and 45 seconds, 46 seconds.
Those 3 men have an issue with addressing authority within their own precinct. To imagine that you could be watching a man actively killing a person, and they probably had fear or were unable to address him either because he had seniority or just because of this relationship the police officers have with each other to not call each other out on their bad behavior. They all had that option.
See, one of the problems I have is when people say it's a small minority that are bad officers. I agree. I know people who are police officers. I respect them a lot. The problem, if you have a department where there's a bad officer and the other ones don't call him out and get him out of there. Let me take you back to the end of World War II. The Nuremberg trials, one of the things that they determined was it is an unacceptable defense to say, I was just following orders.
Exactly. That's something I feel like that's what a robot would say or do.
That's exactly right.
You have to halt your own humanity in order to do these sort of things. What are we actually asking our people to do?
I don't have it at the tip of my tongue, but I shared on Facebook the number for National Guard or military to call if they're being asked to make an illegal action. There's a number that they can call, and I actually posted that on my page on Facebook. I've got a number of veterans. I've got a fairly military family. I've got a lot of veterans in my family. I have 1 active duty guy. I've got a lot of friends that are veterans, and it's very important to make sure that the individual person has a responsibility and has a right to protect not himself, just himself. He's protecting the society. Absolutely. Remember this, at least with the U.S. military, their oath of office is to the Constitution, not to the President, okay? Similarly, the oath of office here, it's talking about serving us here, okay? That's why when we're not served here, we need to fix it. Now, Police Chief Weathers has made some moves, but we need to do a lot more. There are many more things that we need to do, and we need to make sure that they're part of that police contract.
Your friend April and others talk about the social contract that we've had, and it seems like the social contract that we have with our police has been breached, has been broken.
And I think that, again, I want to go back to these demonstrations here in Lexington have been peaceful. There are a couple of situations where an individual person, we recently had somebody jump out of a car and get into a fight with one of our demonstrators, okay? And he initiated the fight, okay? But the demonstrations have been peaceful. The police have also been peaceful.
Our police are generally very cooperative.
Exactly.
I'm very grateful
That's exactly
for
that.
Police.
And I think that, and it's interesting because that has got to be dealt with across the country. How we do, the police have got to be demilitarized, okay? Now again, that's one of the things I can do in federal office. We should not be supplying police, we don't have them here, tanks,
We've had peaceful protests and we've had cooperation from our police. However, they still showed up in riot gear.
In riot gear, right.
Why does every police department in America have riot gear?
Well, it's interesting because I listened to to Chief Weathers talk about it on the day that Mark Stoops and the football team did a march. Linda Gorton was with them, Kathy Witt was with them, Coach Stoops was with them, and Chief Weathers. And Weathers said that because things can boil up quickly and my people can't go get the riot gear, that's why they're in. Now they changed what they do, and I don't know if it's still changed or not, they changed it to a perimeter, so that the people behind that were not in riot gear. The police were not in riot gear when they switched to that. I don't know what it is tonight, I haven't seen it.
What do you think about Andy Bashir being hanged in effigy?
That's horrible. I understand that 200 years ago and 150 years ago, hanging somebody in effigy was a political statement. 150 to 200 years ago.
But these days...
Since then, what happened in the late 1800s, hanging people was generally a anti-black, anti-African American.
Absolutely, it has huge racial connotations.
Right. There's a guy named Brian Stevenson who has an organization called Equal Justice Initiative, and he has worked hard to get people off of death row in Alabama who have been improperly charged and given the death penalty. One of the things he's also been involved in is having a museum that has all the people who have been hung, their names in that museum. I haven't been there, but I've seen pictures of it, and it is really stark to realize that white Americans went out and hung black Americans because they could. Now, bringing that forward to today, when you hang somebody in effigy today, it's not the political statement was 150 years ago. When you hang somebody in effigy, hang somebody like that, you're not just making a political statement, you're making a racial statement also, okay? I have to admit, I'm not African American, but I have African American people in my family. I can't imagine my niece telling her daughters, let me explain what that is now, okay? I can't imagine that. And if you saw the video of it, there was a 4-year-old girl watching that. That was just awful. It's awful, it's wrong. Them going over to stand on the residence with their guns. The guns are totally unnecessary. Banging on the door, totally out of line, utterly out of line. And the people who endorse that kind of thing, I'm totally against that. Now it's interesting. I'm going to segue. You didn't ask me about it, but I'm going to segue anyway. I'm a supporter of the Second Amendment. I believe I have the right to have a gun for protection, okay? I never talk about what I do or don't have. So if anybody asks me, do you have one or don't you have one, I never answer that question, and I will never answer the question.
I won't ask you that.
Okay, but even if you do, I already answered it, okay? But and the reason I'm saying that is, that's a private matter, okay? I do believe, like Judge Scalia did, okay, when he wrote the decision, 2008, that freed all this up, that said you cannot, that people have a right to have a firearm for self-protection, okay? The Heller decision, Heller versus DC decision, 2008, one of the things he wrote in there is, this does not mean that we do not have the right to make restrictions on the use of guns, of what type of guns, and in certain places and times. I have paraphrased that, but the bottom line is Judge Scalia said, there are limitations, there are legitimate limitations. I agree with that statement.
That's great, and that was actually what we were segueing into. So I won't ask you if you have a gun.
I already answered you.
Right, but so let's talk about controlling some of these weapons. So do you think that all guns or all gun owners should be registered?
Today is June 9th, 2020. Our in-person election is 2 weeks from today. I believe that military-style semi-automatic weapons, okay, should not be produced or sold anymore.
Or to
okay?
civilians?
Well, military and police are not getting military-style stuff. They're getting specifically it is. What I say has nothing to do with the military, okay? So I'm talking specifically military-style semi-automatic weaponry. either long guns or pistols, okay? Should not be sold, traded, or anything, okay? However, if you have them and you've acquired them legally, I'm never going to come to you and say they ought to be taken away. I was just flabbergasted when one of the Democratic presidents candidates for president, actually a couple of them, said, we're going to take them. That's BS. That's total BS, because we have a thing called the Constitution. Sure. And if I have acquired something legally, even if there may be a change, what I've done up to this point in time is legal, okay? Right. I think there should be insurance, okay? When you buy a gun or you buy ammunition, I think you should be paying a liability insurance, okay? I think you should be liable if your gun is stolen as involved in a felony or a murder. I believe you're responsible if you haven't reported it. It's tragic to me that a kid in the back seat can pick up a gun and shoot somebody in the front seat, kill them. That's just tragic to me, okay?
So I'm an advocate for responsible gun ownership, and I agree with you. I don't see how we could ever possibly take people's guns away. I'm not advocating for that whatsoever. But I do think that we need common sense restrictions, and I think that we need to be holding people accountable for the kind of damage that's done with their guns. There was a story recently, and it may or may not have been associated with the George Floyd, but I believe that one of his killers had said that he had a gun stolen out of his unlocked vehicle. Personally, I think if you have a gun that's in an unlocked vehicle and someone steals it, I think you should be convicted for that.
But here's the deal.
For recklessly endangering the public.
Actually, I don't agree. If you have a gun in an unlocked car and it gets stolen and it shoots somebody, you're responsible.
Right.
If you have a gun stolen and you've reported it, said, Ms. Moore, I want to tell you that this number, blah, 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 was just stolen. I do not have it in my possession anymore. Yeah, I was a stupid, didn't have it locked, whatever. But the fact of the matter is, unless it's used for something, I don't think you can that you can charge them reckless endangerment. I don't disagree that it is reckless and it does endanger people, but I think that's a bridge too far.
That's fair, but we do need some restrictions, and people do need to be responsible gun owners.
Yeah, very much so. I was very disappointed when they got rid of the classes for concealed carry here in Kentucky.
You have to take tests to drive a car. Why would you not take tests or a lesson to learn how to shoot your gun properly?
And the idea of people walking around with heavy armament is just very, very offensive to me. You know, if I walk in a store where they're doing that, I'm never going to go in that store again. There's no reason to. I'm not going to take my daughter in. I'm not going to take my grandson in. I'm not going to do it. That, again, that comes back to what is my individual right. It may be a right, but it's not common sense to be doing that, in my opinion.
How would you work to end school shootings?
Well, one of the first things is, again, I think reasonable limits on guns is important, but the majority of the shooters are not, I mean, it's a small minority of people. You have to have more responsibility in the terms of mental health people. You have to have improved people in the schools. Mental health professionals has been one of the first things to go in school budgets. We need to bring that back. I am in favor of armed school resource officers, professional armed school resource officers, no volunteers, an individual who is there, who knows how to handle the gun. I'm against teachers having guns in the classroom. That is a serious accident waiting to happen. A kid grabs the gun, shoots a few people. It was supposed to protect and it didn't, okay? So more mental health professionals in the school. Absolutely. We need to identify people who are having a problem. Again, universal health care, meaning people go for mental health. When the ACA passed, I met with a number of other people who met in Andy Barr's office to advocate for not overturning it, okay? One of the people I met there was a psychiatrist here in Lexington, and she said that when ACA passed and people had access to mental health programs, people came out of Eastern Kentucky who had never been to a doctor of any sort in their life. They're now dealing with mental health issues. They're now dealing with substance abuse issues that they never were before. Again, this comes back to the universal health care, where with a private-public partnership, and we've got everybody has access to it, that's what we need. We can't get rid of that. That's insane. The school resource officers I have no problem with, okay, so long as they're trained, okay, and retrained. When I was in insurance sales for a little while with Aflac, okay, I had continuing education I had to take, okay? Teachers do as well. These resource officers should have to as well, okay?
I think that this applies to our issues with police officers and with violence in schools, that one of the biggest issues we need to continue to address is mental health.
Yes.
Alcohol and drug addiction and other mental health services like that.
That's correct.
Are you a religious person, and how does religion guide you on social actions in government?
So I was raised in a very liberal church, and basically what I was raised with is God is good, God is love. Let me see, God is, I used to have a phrase I use. God is love, Jesus is good, and there's some really good stuff in this book here. When I became 35, I became what some people call a born-again Christian. Actually, ironically, President Reagan had declared a year of the Bible. And I realized I'd never read the Bible before. I'd read bits and pieces of it, but I never read it through. So I read it through. And for me, the only conclusion I could come to is it's all hogwash or it's true. And I believe that it's true. Now, so in May of 1985, I accepted Jesus Christ as my Savior and Lord. I call myself a Christ follower. And one of the reasons I say a Christ follower rather than a Christian is there are many people out there who are saying they're a Christian and then saying the most horrible things.
But they don't follow Christ's teachings.
They don't
like
follow
that.
what I see, okay?
Christ follower.
And how does that affect me? Okay, well, number one, I believe in an absolute separation of church and state, absolute, okay? These people are advocating for, bringing prayer back into schools. I caution them. Whose prayer? Who decides it?
They're ignoring the diversity of our country.
They're ignoring that's correct. And I believe, and one of the things about my party in the past, not so much today, but in the past, we were very welcoming of refugees from other countries. That has changed, okay? But we're very welcoming of refugees from other countries, of various religions, ethnic groups, races, and all that. Absolute separation of church and state means my beliefs influence how I think about something, may influence how I vote, but I'm never, ever going to vote for a religious group, per se. I'm never going to vote for something that works for them, but not for everybody else. Right,
thank you. So it's good, your religion can apply to you personally, but it doesn't need to apply to everyone on a broad scale.
Well, and that's exactly right. I've got friends of all faiths and no faith. That's okay. In fact, I've got a friend named Faith. Anyway, sorry. I knew there would be a variety of questions about a variety of things, some of which I hadn't necessarily thought about, but as a candidate, I need to think about. And if I can come to a general conclusion of where I'm at, I'm going to say it. One of the things that always bothers me, and Andy Barr did this last night on KET again, when he was asked, well, how do you feel about another CARES package and all that? His answer wasn't, this is what I think we ought to do. His answer was, I want to see and read their bill before I tell you, okay?
Which is
it's a cop-out. He's got to have an opinion, and these are the questions. She didn't throw any fastballs, they were all softballs. She didn't say, yes or no, do you believe the federal government should be giving more support to the state and local governments for their budgets over and above, separate from COVID-19? She didn't ask that question, she should have, okay? And he should have answered it.
Due to COVID-19, the government has issued several economic stimulus measures, including a round of stimulus checks, business loans, and enhanced unemployment. But will it be enough? Should Americans get a moratorium on rent or mortgage? How long should these benefits last?
Well, here's one of the challenges that we have about COVID-19. We're not looking back at this historically. We're in the middle of it.
Right.
We don't know what's going to happen, how long it's going to happen, or anything. So the support that we provide has got to be something that's proper for today, proper for tomorrow, and the next day. We don't know if it's going to be applicable 2 or 3 months from now. One of the things that Andy Barr did and many other governors did is they put a 3-month requirement. Nobody can get evicted during those 3 months. Doesn't mean they don't owe the rent. They do still owe the rent, but they can't be evicted. That's the kind of thing I think is legitimate. I don't know eventually what can be negotiated about what rent is or isn't owed. I'm not willing to say, I'm not going to sit here and say the rent and the mortgages should be completely written off for all that time, because then I'm messing with the people who invested in the money to build that building.
Absolutely.
You know, and have been paying heating bills for an apartment building.
But we're seeing in other states, they're doing some of this in California, I think in San Francisco, we're seeing where prices for rent are being lowered because people understand that this situation is going to be possible long term.
And it's going to be long term. There was a gentleman in New York, I think he was either in Brooklyn or Queens, and he put a notice on everybody's door, you don't owe rent for next month. That takes chutzpah, and that's a good guy.
Absolutely.
That's a good guy. I didn't really answer your question because I think it doesn't have a simple answer. We have to continue to address it in periods of time. That's why this support for the state and local governments is so important. We can't wait for the effect another month or two. These state governments legally will have to shut their doors. And you're talking about shutting the door on fire, police, EMTs, and all this stuff. When people talk about, well, we can just let the state and local governments go bankrupt, that's flat stupid.
What do you think about a universal basic income?
I've thought about it a little bit. I don't really have an opinion about it, to be honest.
And again, these are complex questions that don't have simple answers, and it's okay if you can just
I understand that
tell us your thoughts.
See, one of the reasons I say I'm a moderate Republican is, and I have a lot of friends who are progressive Democrats, okay? But I don't support Medicare for all. I support a more conservative solution. I don't support the Green New Deal. I support a more conservative solution, okay? I don't know about the universal basic income. I mean, that's just been talked about recently. I know the Democratic candidates have a difference. Does everybody get it? Do the millionaires get it? Whatever. It's a big decision to make. We're doing a little bit of that right now through the taxes, because as you go, there's a certain number of people who don't pay any taxes at all. Now, granted, in order to pay taxes, you have to have some income. So where do you go there? So I don't have an answer for you on that. I don't know.
What's one thing that the federal government could do to reduce our national debt?
Well, we just talked about one, that corporate tax thing that just added to it. It wasn't necessary. Another thing we can do, we've got to look closer at the budget. One of my big issues is veterans care and military budget. The military budget is bloated, okay? We don't know how bloated because there hasn't been a good accounting for it, okay? That's what we've got to do. We've got to do a full analysis of every part of the budget, okay? Because I believe that there's probably 5 or 10% of that could be reduced. I believe the military budget should be moved more towards educating the troops, okay? Making sure that the proper number of parts for the equipment you have in these various locations. And I also believe that we have military units overseas in places they don't belong.
They're where they shouldn't be. Okay. And 5 or 10% of our military budget is a huge amount of money.
That's $35 to $70 billion.
Sure.
And over a 10-year period, that's a lot. You were talking about how to get at the reducing the national debt. That's a hard thing. But it's got to be worked on. It's got to be done.
Right.
You know, and there's nobody working on it. The quote-unquote fiscal conservatives blew it up. You know, the last budget was $1 trillion when they passed it. Both the Democrats and the Republicans are responsible for this. They passed a budget that was $1 trillion over what the income was. I don't know about you, but I can't do that.
I don't get it.
Okay? They've got to do it. Plus, the other thing that just irks me, okay? My grandson's 8 years old, okay? When those guys did that corporate tax cut that added $1 to $2 trillion to national debt, okay? That's not funny money. We are paying interest on that, and a lot of the interest we're paying is to China, where we borrowed the money from. So I can look at my 8-year-old grandson until he's my age, 68, number of years he's working. I worked 51 years, mostly full time, okay? That entire time, the taxes he's paying are helping to defray the cost of the interest. not even the principal, the interest. We've got to get that under control, and we have not gotten that under control. And there's nobody there, in my opinion, that's really talking about it. They're not.
What do you think about payday lending, and how would you address predatory loan practices?
The idea of payday lending is honestly anathema to me, because the people who are doing it are getting into these cycles. Okay, I know people who have gotten into it and they haven't gotten out of it for years and years and years. Part of the reason is I think their practices need to be much more tightly controlled. Okay, now I'm not going to sit here and say, well, Andy Barr gets donations from that industry, but he does. I think that the payday loans have got to have a radically reduced amount of interest, and how they're operated. I'm not going to give a number because I don't know.
I think that payday lending can sometimes have interest rates, it sounds crazy, but can be anywhere from, can be up to 400% interest. And it's mostly in low income and minority communities who do not have the sort of access to banking and loans that we have in more affluent communities. So people get stuck trying to borrow even small amounts of money, right, because they can't access loans from banks. And then they're already lower income people, and then being asked to pay astronomical interest rates that through your bank you don't incur.
Right. So one of the trap is these are 2-week loans primarily. Okay. Samantha Moore has a problem. She's getting married and she has to pay her hairdresser, and she doesn't have $150. So she goes and she borrows $150, payable back in 2 weeks with a slight interest on it. But in 2 weeks, if she can't pay it back, they'll redo that loan, the $150 plus the interest, and again, it's a 2-week loan. And it's not just urban, because you're talking rural people as well. And what you're talking about, again, let's go back to another issue, healthcare. The number one reason for bankruptcies in the United States of America is medical costs, okay? Because the other countries don't have that, they don't have that. I told you I sold Aflac Insurance for a while. The only reason Aflac exists is because healthcare is inefficient, okay? Aflac and that kind of insurance is not health insurance. Mm-hmm. It's supplemental insurance. It'll pay you things when, this isn't an ad, it'll pay you things like your so many dollars a day when you're in the hospital, or things like this. But the reason all that's necessary is because the people are still probably getting charged for the hospital stuff. So what you're talking about, going back to the payday loans, some of this is just to be able to survive. The healthcare breaks my heart. To pay their bills. It breaks my heart that people my age are choosing between medicine, mm-hmm, and food and rent. That's criminal. President Reagan said we're going to be a city on the hill, a city that's the inspiration is we're going to be the city on the hill that people look at. That's a quote from the Bible, okay? We're not the city on the hill right now.
So do you agree, or do you see our middle class shrinking? Like,
oh,
as
my gosh,
these corporate taxes, they're getting tax cuts, and it seems like the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer, and our middle class is dwindling. So
over the last 40 years, there's been a radical shift of the amount of wealth that Americans have who are not in the top 1 or 2%. And it's moved to there. It's as bad as during the time of the robber barons that Teddy Roosevelt, one of my heroes, fought, okay? He fought to get rid of these monopolies and things like that. We have the same thing going on today. The middle class has shrunk 10 or 20% since its height. Here's another thing that people may not be aware of. The average Americans used to have, 60% of Americans used to own stock. Mm-hmm. It's now a little over 50%. That's just since 2008. Mm-hmm. 2008 may sound familiar to you. Housing crush, okay? The other thing that's happened, do you realize that today more people rent than own houses? Exactly. It's a huge issue. More people own than rented. Mm-hmm. And to go back to our discussion about protesting, it was brought up, and this is a very important issue, when
when protesters are being accused of looting or destroying their own communities or their own property. And the point was raised that they don't own that property, and that's part of the problem, is that many Americans do not even own their own homes, and that's having a huge impact on our economy.
Right. And one of the things I want to say, going back to the whole question about looters, again, these people are not part of the demonstrations. They're people taking advantage of it. I saw one picture of this white guy all masked up with a hammer just going boom, 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 boom to a bunch of windows. He had no connection to any protest. People within the protest were trying to stop him from doing that. He was just messing around and making it look like it was bad. So the fact of the matter is that too many of us don't own our own homes, okay? And again, this has a racial component, because for many, many, many years, African Americans were redlined out of getting loans.
Absolutely.
Okay, and that meant the average wealth that an African American family has today is $10,000 or $20,000, versus the average white American is 90, 100, 110 something. It's a huge gap, and it's been there a long time. We're not making a lot of progress on it, to be honest. But again, let's come back to healthcare, okay? With proper healthcare, many of these people will not have to be spending their last dime. Do I spend it on medicine? Do I spend it on food? Or do I spend it on rent? I spend it on my wife's medicine. I'll skip my own, and we'll both eat a dry piece of toast. Shouldn't be. We're the shining city on a hill, but right now, that shine has lost a lot of its luster.
So let's talk about another industry. Our postal system could run out of money this year, which would have huge impacts on local businesses, as well as people who get essential services through the mail, such as prescription medication or government benefits. Do you think the U.S. Postal Service should be funded?
I think it should be funded, and one of the things that a lot of people aren't aware of is the reason the U.S. Postal Service is in such dire straits is several years back a bill was passed where they had to fund the retirements of all their employees at once. That money had to be there. So they, unlike other places where they fund stuff as they go along, all that came out as a chunk right away. So all this talk about the U.S. Postal Service is not efficient, U.S. Postal Service was asked to do things that no other business does. It absolutely should be funded. That ridiculous thing should be turned around, okay? And it's just terrible to me to hear people keep talking about, well, they should just be smarter with their money. The legislature, the Congress said, you have to do this.
Right. It almost seems like it was planned strategically so that our postal system would fail. And so that it could be taken over or bought up by private companies.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not willing to go that far, but I'll tell you what, as a lot of people in Kentucky can understand, that's flat stupid. We shouldn't be doing that.
We should not be doing that. The Postal Service is pretty amazing. I've done a lot of traveling, and nowhere that I have ever been has a better postal system than in the United States of America. It's unheard of how quickly and easily that you can get packages and things sent across the country. But we're already seeing some effects of that right now, of how our USPS is being slowed down significantly. Andy Barr has raised $17 million. How do you compete against that kind of money? And do you think Citizens United has taken power away from the people?
Yes. As I said early on, I think Citizens United should be reversed. I don't think that all this dark money should be allowed into politics at all. The $17 million, I just want to say the $17 million is his money he's raised for his personal campaign over the 5 election periods. A lot of the money that was spent in the past with him has been outside. He has only raised a little over $2 million right now for this election period. Now, I fully believe that this election cycle can have tens of millions of dollars spent on it. So you asked, how do I compete with that? Well, I compete with that like this, talking to people, getting them to talk to their friends and neighbors and all that.
Being honest and transparent.
I'm doing the best I can, and I don't block my wife from my Facebook page, so if I say something dumb and stupid, she's going to tell me. But on a serious note, I don't. It really galls me that the only time we see Andy Barr is for a photo opportunity with an individual group. Okay, in 2018, the League of Women Voters had a debate in the primaries. He didn't come. Together Frankfurt had a debate out at Kentucky State University. He didn't come. Okay, Democrats came, I came. Okay, there were numerous. There were several black sororities that had a debate. He didn't come. Okay, so he goes where it's only convenient for him or where it's a friendly environment, which is what he had last night.
Seems like debating is not his strong suit.
Debating is not his strong suit at all. And it's funny because being a lawyer, you'd think he would know how to debate, but I'm not a lawyer, but he doesn't want to talk to me.
What's more important, states' rights or the rights of the country as a whole?
This country started out with the concept that each state had a lot more rights than the federal government. It has evolved to the federal government having a lot more rights than we started out with. One of the things people forget about the Constitution is the rights that are not enumerated in it are reserved to the states and the individuals. Okay? The whole states' rights issue, unfortunately, many times has been code word for we want to restrict certain parts of our population from doing certain things. That was the Civil War, the war between the states.
I could pick some buzzword issues: abortion and the legalization of marijuana.
Right, and see, I think that it's not an easy answer. I'm not going to say that one is ascendant over the other. What I do believe is we need to have much more commonality in the country. Okay, for instance, one of the things with healthcare and why having a universal system, private-public partnership, is, remember when I said your healthcare should not depend on your zip code? If I cross the river into Ohio or Indiana, I should not be restricted from dealing with the same people I am right now. Okay? In the past, I said I was in the insurance business. You get an insurance license in individual states. You get a medical license in individual states. I think we need to move past that. I think that there are many things that in the past were strictly the purview of the state that are getting in the way of our country advancing. So I think that's got to be looked at really hard. And I think we've got to have some situations where, now for interstate commerce, the federal government took that. If I'm in Kentucky and I sell something in Tennessee, I'm subject to the federal government, not just Tennessee or Kentucky. I think there's many other areas we need to look at that as well. I'm disturbed at people who are trying to pass the concealed carry thing and say, I should be able to take it anywhere. The states that have the highest amount of deaths by gunshots are the ones who have the least restrictions. I don't want people going from there to where it is more restricted. Now, I'm not talking cities, I'm talking states. People talk about, well, look at Chicago, look at whatever. It's a state. The entire country, I think this is a situation where we need to look at a national program.
Just the way our world is now, it's so easy to travel back and forth, and we have people who work in multiple states, sometimes on a daily basis. People go back and forth. Interestingly
enough, states' rights during the COVID-19 have protected Kentuckians more than some others.
I absolutely agree.
I mean, Andy Barr said, we're closed.
Mm-hmm. And that's why we have been so much more successful than all of the states around us. We've been able to protect
And what's interesting is, it was Democrat and Republican governors both. Larry Hogan of Maryland, moderate Republican governor. Charlie Baker of Massachusetts, moderate Republican governor. Jim DeWine of Ohio. I'm not going to say moderate Republican because he's not really a moderate, but he's a smart Republican. See how he worked that in there? He and Andy both did smart things early on. Ironically, in that case, the states' rights protected us. Overall, we need to look at having much more of a national look to things. We also spend a lot of extra money as Americans because we have some of these things that are duplicated. What happens when two big companies merge? They get rid of redundancies, okay? We've got 50 states and a District of Columbia, and many of the systems we have could be perhaps reduced in cost if they were not consolidated. We've got it in Kentucky. How many counties do we have? 120 counties, okay? One of our counties, Robertson, has 5,000 people.
All right, let's talk about the environment. And
I'm a fan, by the way.
That's good, me too. Are you concerned about climate change?
I am extremely concerned about climate change. My dad was a PhD research scientist. He started out in chemistry and then he worked on computers. In fact, when I was 3 years old, he was one of the pioneers working on computers in the U.S. government. He worked for the USDA, United States Department of Agriculture. When I was growing up outside Philadelphia and you drive down for the traffic, you could see the smoke coming out of the cars everywhere, smog and everything. You don't see that today. We're downtown Lexington, Kentucky, and I don't see any smoke coming out of any of the cars.
Because we had regulations against our emissions.
That's right.
That brought down our pollution.
And that started under President Nixon, the Environmental Protection Agency was started under him. Climate change is very, very serious, okay? When I say I'm not in favor of the Green New Deal, when the Green New Deal was first published, it had all this stuff in it. Focus on it? Absolutely, we've got to. Greta Thunberg, I have immense admiration for her and a lot of the youth that are working so hard on this. We cannot say, number one, climate change is real. People who say it's not real are, they have their heads where they can't see or breathe, okay? So, because climate change is happening, okay? How much is human caused? How much is not human caused? Very interesting, this COVID-19 pandemic, our satellites first saw over Wuhan in China a lot less smog, a lot less pollution. So I'm 68, okay? Lord willing and the creek don't rise, I'll be around another 10, 15, 20, 30 years, okay? But my grandson is 8. 30 years from now, he's gonna be 38, a couple years older than my daughter. I don't want to see it go back to what I grew up with outside Philadelphia. I don't want to see the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland catch fire again. We can't be doing that, okay? And my heart aches and cries for the people in eastern Kentucky and West Virginia whose water is so polluted, who are in such dire straits, and then we have an administration that's saying we need to roll back these regulations because they're harming the companies. How about the people?
Do you think that coal companies should be held accountable for environmental disasters? Should the government hold corporations accountable for contaminating our groundwater?
So, companies should be accountable. However, the government, which has allowed them to operate under those systems for a long time without demanding, has to have a role in it, okay? To go to a coal company and say, you are allowed to operate all this time. We have now decided that you are evil menaces to the society. The people who are operating at 10, 20, 30, 50, 80 years ago were not looking that way. You see a lot of people with the coal license plates. Mm-hmm. The fact of the matter is, Eastern Kentucky was built on coal. Sure. Okay. Now what do we do today? We've got to do something for those people. And one of the things we can't do is oppose proper black lung management, as McConnell's been one of the ones who's done that. And Andy Barr, and one of the reasons I mention the two together is because they're kind of stitched at the hip. You know, they really are. Let me give you an example. They were separating families at the border a couple of years ago, okay? They were taking kids away from their mothers and fathers, okay? Andy Barr took 3 days to say, you know, I don't think this is a good thing. We shouldn't be doing that. He took 3 days. Everybody else in the world, including myself, said, this is an abomination. Especially as a Christ follower, that idea absolutely blows my mind. So he took 3 days to do that. Remember I mentioned earlier on, he took 85 days to say that the killing of Breonna Taylor was a bad thing. He took from Memorial Day to last Thursday to say the killing of George Floyd was a bad thing. And in his statement, which by the way was never on Twitter, and it was never on his website. It was only on Facebook, okay? And his statement was, this is really terrible and horrible, and the police ought to be held, the individuals ought to be held accountable, but most of the police are fine. But then he segued to, but this looting and violence and all that is awful too. He's not putting the priorities in the right place. Looting and violence, 0.01% of what's going on. Peaceful demonstrations, this much. But he took from May 25th to June 4th, let me see now, that's 6 plus 4 is 10, that's 10 days before he realized it was a bad thing. Or he would say so. And he never did on his Twitter account, he's pretty active on that. And he never did on his website. He did on Facebook.
So are you concerned about coal sludge in Martin County poisoning drinking water?
Oh, absolutely. We've had a drinking problem, water drinking problem. I'm not going to speak to drinking problems, but water drinking problem in Martin County for a long time. And we have to fix that as a state and as a nation. You look at up in Michigan, they had the same problem. And it is definitely our, meaning the society's fault, and we have to fix that. I'm very concerned about that. But again, going back to your earlier question, do we just hold the coal companies accountable? Most of those coal companies have gone bankrupt. I mean, that ship has sailed, okay?
We should probably be reinvesting in newer technologies.
Oh, we should definitely be investing.
Solar or something like that.
We really should of many things, and there's no reason that the people in those areas that we can't put factories there. But that still doesn't answer, what do we do about the coal wash now? We've got to fix it, we've got to clean it up. We had the Superfund a few years ago from the EPA. The Love Canal thing was the thing that just prompted all of that. That's the same kind of problem. We have to deal with that. But when you ask about the companies, they don't exist anymore, on the whole. That's why it's going to have to be a governmental thing.
Are you concerned about radioactive dumping in Estill County?
I used to live in Estill County. I'll tell you what, when we found out about that, we as a county kind of went into shock. We didn't know it was coming. We didn't know about it until after it happened.
I imagine a lot of Kentuckians don't know about it now.
Yeah, it's a big problem. Does radioactive waste have to go somewhere? Yes. It's got to go somewhere. But it's got to go somewhere, and people need to be aware of it, and we need to have better controls. I mean, I used to take my stuff to the dump at Estill County. I used to have a small horse farm in Estill County for 14 years. And there were things that I had to take to the dump, okay? The thought that when I'm going to the dump, I'm also exposing myself to radiation is just mind-blowing.
Do you agree that these types of locations are often chosen because the area is rural or poor?
You're going to have to choose these areas because they're rural, no matter where they are, okay? You're not going to do it in the middle of a city, okay? I think that it may have in the past been chosen for those reasons. That doesn't mean it has to remain that way. What we have to do is it's got to be more transparent. We've got to say as a society, because you have all these iPhones, okay, because you have all this technical equipment, because you've got that fancy new 75-foot TV screen, okay, something has to be done with it. So we have to be disposing of that in a responsible way, but we got to do it on a transparent basis. The problem with what happened in Estill County is we didn't know.
Do you support the Electoral College?
I don't have an opinion about it. The Electoral College has been around a long time. The Electoral College's purpose was to have small states have the same opportunity, not the same opportunity, but to have more of an impact than they would be if it was strictly a popular vote, okay? There have been a number of presidents who have won popular vote and lost Electoral College.
Donald Trump lost the popular vote.
I don't think that's the first thing we need to put priority on. I really don't. I think there's so many other things we need to emphasize. For somebody to win a national election, they have got to campaign where they need to. Now let's go back to Citizens United, okay? To win a national campaign, there will be over $1 trillion spent on the presidential race this year. $1 trillion, okay?
It's a lot of money.
It's a lot of money. Between the individuals, between the super PACs, between everything else, there's going to be $1 trillion spent on it. That's $1 trillion that doesn't actually help the economy grow. It helps individual people make a lot of money.
Right.
But it doesn't really help the economy
grow. It's not being
grow.
infused into our community.
Right. And when you spend $1 trillion, that means that Chuck Eddy or Samantha Moore doesn't really have any impact on it. I think that's wrong. I think that's a bigger problem than the Electoral College and the popular vote.
Thinking that the candidate who has the most money, raises the most money, is going to win.
Right.
That makes me sick to my stomach.
It makes me sick to my stomach too. But here's the thing. That's different question, the Electoral College and popular vote. Sure. The money is a different question. I think we need to address that. And I'll be real honest, trying to get rid of the Electoral College, to me, is almost a waste of time. All worlds being perfect, everybody needs to be fairly represented within their localities or states or the federal government. But to spend our energy on that, I don't see the importance of it.
Should there be term limits for all political offices?
Absolutely. For the House of Representatives, it should be 6 terms, 12 years. For the Senate, it should be 2 terms, 12 years. And for the presidency, it should be 2 terms, 8 years. And what that means is we're going to back off of having professional politicians, okay? That means if somebody decides, what I want to do is I want to be in the government, elected to the government, federal government. So you got 12, 24, 8, 32. That's 32 years you spend impacting the federal government. That's enough. Mm-hmm. I believe at every level of office, mayor, city councilman, commissioners, there should be term limits.
I think it would be better if we had more people involved in the process.
Right, and one of the things that people say, well, we shouldn't do that because there's some people, well, John McCain, I voted for him. He's one of my heroes. He was in there a long time too. The idea that these people need to stay in so long so they know how to manipulate the system so when they become chairman of the committee, they can operate it properly is bananas. Right. That's not working the system for me. Not working the system for you.
It's really good for them.
It's really good for them.
Yeah.
We see an example of it. Mitch McConnell.
I think that the more representation and just the more individuals that we have in our government, the more diverse perspectives we're going to see, and then we just won't have people who stay in for the wrong reasons.
Exactly.
How much social media time will you make to personally attack your political opponents?
To attack my political opponents? I post stuff against my political opponent, but it's political stuff. Andy Barr may be a nice person. I don't know. He may be decent to his wife, maybe decent to his kids.
You see no reason to attack him personally?
No. I will tell you this, I'm in favor of him spending more time with his family beginning in January.
Some people do, use their political platform to drag their opponents through the mud. So.
I don't. Number one, I've not heard a hint of any indiscretions on Andy Barr's part, financially or personally or anything, not a hint, okay? So I see no reason to try to find something. I used to say, well, I guess he's a nice guy. I don't say that as much anymore because the policies he's voted for have been harmful to so many people. But as a person, as an individual, there's not been a hint of indiscretion or anything about him. And anybody who would say he's bad for this, that, or the other reason, personally, I would have a hard time believing it. He's been in the public eye for a while. If he was going to screw up, he had plenty of opportunity to do it.
Are liberals evil?
Are liberals evil? Well, here's the problem. Liberals, moderates, conservatives, let's examine those words for a minute. Liberal, L-I-B-E-R-A-L, moderate, M-O-D-E-R-A-T, conservatives, C-O-N-S-E-R-V-A-T-I-V. They've got some of the same letters in all of them, so I guess not.
Republicans currently have a minority in the Congress. If Democrats preserve their majority, how will you work across the aisle to make meaningful legislation?
The most progress has been made in this country over the last 50 or 60 years from the center. Moderate Republicans working with centrist Democrats have gotten so many of these things done. Too much hard right, too much hard left have not accomplished things. One of the tragedies of our recent era is the Affordable Care Act was passed without any Republican votes, not a one. The tax cut was passed without Democratic votes, not a one. That to me says they're stupid.
We're not finding common ground.
We're not finding the common ground. Do I believe the people who voted against the ACA were wrong? I do. Do I think the people who voted for the tax cut are wrong? I do. But to have it completely partisan like that, that's insane. One example, somebody did a study, I forget who it was, of 40 years ago, the senators, okay, and their interaction with people of the other party, okay? 40 years ago, you had a lot of interaction. It gradually disappeared. Newt Gingrich is one of the ones who helped that, said, you shouldn't be having dinner with your enemy. I paraphrased his words. They're not your enemy.
We're not enemies.
That's exactly right, okay? I've got friends who are Republican, friends who are Democrat, Libertarian, Independents, okay? My goal is to serve the people of Kentucky. To serve the people of Kentucky, I got to talk to these different people and have stuff done. Whether I'm in a caucus, and I consider myself an independent Republican, okay, because you're not going to tell me how to vote, okay? I'm going to work with people on the other side of the aisle. I'm going to work with people within the caucus. We've got to get away from the us and them mentality. It's not a red team, it's not a blue team. It's an American team. And the sooner we get that through the thick skulls of the politicians, the better all of us Americans are going to be.
It seems like if you get into office that you'd be willing to work with Republicans and Democrats to make the best things happen that are going to be good for all Kentuckians.
And here's a step further, okay? To be successful in the Congress, and when I said that the most advances have been made is when the center has worked together, centrists, Democrats, moderate Republicans have worked together. You don't just work with each other across the aisle. You've got to talk to the different federal agencies, get their learning, get their understanding, get their education. One of the dangers of the current situation is people in those agencies have been blocked from coming to testify to Congress. That's wrong.
That's wrong.
To me, a subpoena from the Congress should be honored. Absolutely. Okay? So I would talk to the other side, quote unquote, okay, across the aisle. Not my enemy.
We're all Americans.
Not another gang. You know, no gang signs, no tattoos, no spray painting or stuff. So, and with the people in the federal offices, the people who've been there for 20 or 30 years, through Democrats and Republicans, and know what they're doing. One of the tragedies to me is that so much of the upper management of so many of these offices have left. And that's a tragedy. That's got to stop. And people like Andy Barr have allowed that to happen, haven't fought against it. One of my problems with Andy Barr and COVID-19 is he didn't do anything. He didn't say, oh my God, wait a minute, this is serious, okay? And he's pandering now when he says we need to investigate the Chinese who caused this to happen. I can't say it here, but it's a word beginning with B, has 8 letters and ends in T, okay? Our problem with COVID-19 is partially China's fault. But as soon as it left China and hit South Korea and the United States, it's all on us.
Absolutely.
110,000 deaths, American deaths.
They could have been prevented.
273 South Korean deaths. You started to say something about contact tracing. We didn't talk about that. My apologies. I believe in contact tracing. It should be done. That's how the South Koreans kept it down, okay? Contact tracing is not an interference with my civil rights. It's public health. That's why we have vaccinations. If you don't want to have vaccinations, if you don't want to be contact traced, go live on an island and don't come around none of mine.
Well,
Did I answer all your questions?
You answered all the questions that I had and then some.
And then some, oh my gosh.
Yeah. And I'm grateful for your candor and your honesty and your willingness to answer all of these questions.
Well, thank you. I appreciate them. Some of the questions are, stuff I haven't thought about. The whole thing about UBI. Until Andrew Yang was talking about it, I never
It's
even
a new
thought
concept.
about it.
I'd never even heard of it
Finland did it. I don't know if they're still doing it or a test, but I don't know. And that's why I say, I don't have an opinion.
Sure.
So.
Not enough information yet.
A very famous man once said, I knows what I knows, and I knows what I don't knows. And the good thing is I knows what I don't knows is not something I knows. My name is Chuck Eddy. I approve the posting of this interview. I would appreciate your vote for Congress in the 6th District. I'm a moderate Republican running against Andy Barr. I think we can be better served. I think I'm the man to do that. Thank you very much again.
And we are here to inform you and ask you to inform and educate yourself and your friends. So if you'd like to learn more about other candidates, please stay tuned. Signing off, Samantha Jean with Couchfire Media.